There is a book that has been read by more human beings than any other document in the history of civilization. It has been translated into over 3,000 languages. It has shaped empires, ended wars, comforted the dying, and ignited revolutions. Billions of people have held it in their hands and believed with everything in them that it contains the very words of God. And yet, this book is full of things it refuses to explain. Not by accident, not by omission, on purpose. The Bible is one of the most deliberately mysterious documents ever written, and what I want to explore with you today, what I want us to sit inside together for the next 25 minutes, is the possibility that those mysteries are not a problem to be solved. They are a message to be received. Because here is the question that has haunted theologians, scholars, rabbis, monks, and ordinary believers for 3,000 years. Why would a God who desperately wants to be known choose to hide things? Why would the author of all truth leave gaps? Why would the important book in human history contain stories that begin in the middle of nowhere, characters who appear without explanation, and commands to stay silent about the most extraordinary things ever witnessed? What if the silence is the sermon? What if the mystery is the message? I want to take you through 3 doorways today. 3 places in Scripture where the text goes quiet in ways that are so unusual, so deliberate, so strange, that the silence itself becomes louder than any explanation could be. By the time we walk through the 3rd doorway, I believe you will see the Bible differently, not as a smaller book, but as a much, much larger one. Let us begin. The first doorway opens in the 14th chapter of Genesis. Abraham has just returned from battle. He has rescued his nephew Lot from a coalition of kings. He is a warrior returning from war, and he is about to have one of the strangest encounters in all of Scripture. A man walks out to meet him. His name is Melchizedek, and that is almost everything the Bible tells us about him. Genesis chapter 14 gives us exactly 3 verses. Melchizedek is the king of Salem, which most scholars believe is the ancient name for Jerusalem. He is also described as a priest of God Most High. He brings out bread and wine. He blesses Abraham. Abraham gives him a tenth of everything he has just won in battle, and then Melchizedek is gone. 3 verses, no introduction, no backstory, no parents, no tribe, no genealogy. In a book that is obsessed with genealogy, in a text that will spend entire chapters listing who begat whom and who begat whom after them, Melchizedek arrives with nothing. No origin, no explanation, and no ending. He simply appears. He blesses one of the most important figures in all of human history, and he vanishes. Now, in the ancient world, genealogy was not a trivial matter. It was identity. It was legitimacy. It was proof that you belonged somewhere, that you came from someone, that your authority had a traceable human source. Every king listed his ancestors. Every priest proved his lineage. The absence of a genealogy in the ancient Near East was not just unusual, it was almost unthinkable, and yet the author of Genesis records this meeting with no apparent concern for the gaping questions it creates. Who is this man? Where did he come from? How is he already a priest of the God that Abraham serves? How does he have this authority? The text does not answer. The text does not even acknowledge that there is a question. Then, nearly 1,000 years later, Melchizedek reappears. In Psalm 110, one of the great messianic psalms of David, God says to the coming king, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aaron, not in the priestly line that Israel knows and follows. In the order of this nameless, ageless, genealogyless priest-king from a single encounter in Genesis 14. And then, another 1,000 years after that, the writer of the book of Hebrews in the New Testament returns to Melchizedek and says something extraordinary. He says that Melchizedek was without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. Like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever, without beginning of days or end of life. The writer of Hebrews is not saying Melchizedek was careless with his paperwork. He is saying that the silence in Genesis chapter 14 was intentional, that the lack of origin story, the lack of lineage, the lack of a death notice, all of it was a theological portrait painted in absence. The Bible left out the details on purpose, because what was being communicated required a figure who stood outside the normal categories of human identity. A figure who pointed toward someone eternal. 3 millennia, 3 texts, one mysterious figure with no biography. And what the Bible is doing, what it is doing so quietly that most readers flip past it without stopping, is building a portrait of eternity using the tools of silence. It is saying, some things cannot be explained by human origins because they did not begin with human origins. The first doorway has opened. Now let us walk through the second. We have to go back to Genesis, back to a time before Abraham, before the flood, before almost everything. We arrive at chapter 6. And the text does something that has stopped readers cold for thousands of years. Listen to what it says. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old men of renown. 6 verses, that is what we get. 6 verses to describe what appears to be a catastrophic intersection between the human and the divine, an event so significant it seems to contribute to the conditions that bring about the flood of Noah, and then nothing. The text moves on. It does not explain who the sons of God are. It does not explain what the Nephilim were. It does not explain how this happened, what it meant, or why God allowed it. It simply states it and continues walking. The Nephilim. The word itself is one of the most disputed in all of Hebrew scholarship. Some translate it as fallen ones, some as giants. The ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint, renders it as giants. The book of Numbers, much later in Scripture, refers to the descendants of the Nephilim as men so large that the Israelite spies felt like grasshoppers beside them. And yet the Bible never pauses to define the term properly, never stops to explain the phenomenon, never draws a clean theological conclusion about what these beings were or where they went. 3,000 years of interpretation have produced an extraordinary range of answers. Ancient Jewish texts like the Book of Enoch, which was widely read in the centuries around the time of Jesus, expand the story enormously, describing the Nephilim as the offspring of rebellious angels who descended to earth, taught humanity forbidden knowledge, and unleashed a kind of spiritual catastrophe. Some of the earliest church fathers took this view seriously. Others argued that the sons of God were simply the godly line of Seth intermarrying with the ungodly line of Cain, a naturalistic interpretation that avoids supernatural beings entirely but struggles to explain why these unions would produce something called the Nephilim at all. The debate is ancient. It is unresolved, and it is unresolved because the Bible will not resolve it for us. But here is what I find most striking. The text does not treat this passage as a problem. It does not seem to notice our confusion. It records the existence of these beings with the same calm matter-of-factness that it uses to record the weather. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. Full stop, move on. And I think that is actually the point. Because what the Bible is doing in Genesis 6 is not trying to write a mythology of supernatural beings. It is trying to describe the moral and spiritual condition of a world that had become saturated with a kind of corruption that defied simple categorization. It is using language that its original audience would have found deeply familiar, the language of divine beings interacting with human ones, language common throughout the ancient Near East. But it is stripping that language of its original mythological conclusions. It is saying, something broke, something invaded, something corrupted. But it is not giving you a manual for understanding the mechanics. Because the mechanics are not what matters. What matters is the consequence. The text is pointing past the phenomenon to the meaning, and the meaning is this. The world had become so entangled with forces hostile to its creator that it required a reset. Noah, the flood, a new beginning. The Nephilim remain mysterious not because the Bible's authors did not know the answer, but because spelling out the answer would have shifted our attention from the theological truth to the spectacle. God keeps the camera on the human drama, on Noah's righteousness, on the world's corruption, on the faithfulness of one family, and lets the Nephilim stand in the background, enormous and unexplained, like a shadow that tells you something terrible passed it through, but does not show you the thing itself. The Bible understands something that every great storyteller understands. What you do not show is often more powerful than what you do. Now the third doorway, this one is in the New Testament, and it may be the most startling silence of all. We are in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 17. Jesus takes 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, up onto a high mountain. These are his inner circle, his most trusted, the ones he calls when he needs witnesses. And on this mountain, something happens that the Gospel accounts describe with language that strains under the weight of what it is trying to convey. Jesus is transfigured before them. His face shines like the sun. His clothes become white as light itself. And then standing beside him, visible present in conversation with him, are Moses and Elijah. Moses, the great lawgiver who had been dead for over 1,000 years. Elijah, the prophet who had been taken up in a whirlwind of fire and never died in the conventional sense. Both of them there. Both of them real. Both of them talking with Jesus. Peter, who has never been accused of being overly cautious, immediately begins talking. He wants to build shelters, tabernacles, one for each of the three figures. He wants to mark this place, to anchor this moment, to make something permanent of it. And then a bright cloud envelops them all. A voice speaks, the same words spoken at Jesus' baptism. "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." The disciples fall on their faces in absolute terror. Jesus comes to them and touches them and says, simply, "Get up. Do not be afraid." And when they lift their heads, Moses and Elijah are gone. Only Jesus remains. They walk back down the mountain, and then comes the instruction that stops everything. "Tell no one what you have seen until the Son of Man is raised from the dead." Tell no one. You have just witnessed the most extraordinary thing any human being has ever seen. You have watched your teacher become luminous. You have stood in the same space as Moses and Elijah. You have heard the audible voice of God, and the command, the direct, explicit command, is silence. Peter and James and John are instructed to carry the most spectacular secret in human history and keep it entirely to themselves. And the text says they did. They kept it. They told no one until later. Now why? Why command silence about something this extraordinary? If the purpose was to announce that Jesus was divine, was the Son of God, was the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, why not let the witnesses speak? Why not send them down the mountain with the story that would settle every argument, answer every skeptic, and confirm every doubt? Theologians have offered answers. Some say that the revelation would have been misunderstood before the resurrection, that people would have tried to make Jesus a political king by force, and the transfiguration would have become rocket fuel for a revolution Jesus did not come to start. Some say that the full meaning of the transfiguration could only be understood after the cross, that without the resurrection it would have been just a miracle, impressive but incomplete. These are thoughtful answers, and yet the text gives us none of them. The text simply reports the command. Keep silence. And we are left standing in that silence with Peter and James and John. But I want to suggest something. I want to suggest that the command to silence is not just a practical instruction about timing. It is itself part of the revelation. Because what Jesus is teaching his three most trusted disciples on that mountain is not only something about his identity, he is teaching them something about how divine things are carried. They cannot go down the mountain and announce this, not because it would not be believed, but because the proper response to an encounter with the living God is not immediately to broadcast it. It is first to be changed by it, to carry it, to let it work in you, to be transformed by the weight of what you have witnessed before you open your mouth about it at all. The silence that Jesus commands is not a gag order. It is a gestation period. The transfiguration needed to live inside those three men, terrifying them, reorienting them, rebuilding their entire understanding of who Jesus was, before it could be spoken. Some things are too holy to be announced before they have been absorbed. And so we arrive at the place where all three of these mysteries have been taking us. Melchizedek without a genealogy, the Nephilim without an explanation, the transfiguration with a command to be silent. Three moments in Scripture where the text goes deliberately, purposefully, theologically quiet. And the question underneath all three is the same. Why does a God who wants to be known choose to hide things? Here is the answer I have come to believe, after sitting with these mysteries for a long time. The Bible is not hiding things from us. It is hiding things for us. There is a profound difference. When a teacher gives a student every answer on a worksheet before the test, the student learns nothing. The struggle, the reaching, the wrestling, the sitting in uncertainty, that is where transformation happens. That is where the learning becomes part of you, rather than simply information you possess. The ancient rabbis had a practice they called wrestling with the text. It was not metaphorical. They believed that to genuinely engage with Scripture, you had to be willing to be uncomfortable, to sit with a question longer than felt reasonable, to refuse the easy answer and keep pushing. Because God, they believed, was not hiding in the easy answers. God was waiting in the hard questions. And what the Bible's silences do, the deliberate, strategic, theologically loaded silences, is force us into exactly that posture. They do not let us be passive consumers of information. They require us to become active seekers of truth. Every time you encounter a Melchizedek and find yourself asking, "But who was he really?" you are being drawn deeper into the text, deeper into the tradition, deeper into the conversation between humanity and God. Every time the Nephilim leave you unsatisfied, reaching for more, unwilling to let it go, you are being shaped by your own seeking in ways that a tidy answer never could have shaped you. And the Transfiguration silence, that is the most intimate of all. Because what Peter and James and John were given was not just a vision. They were given a sacred burden. Something too large for casual speech. Something that had to be held and turned over and wept about in the dark before it could be offered to the world. The silence was not a limitation on the disciples. It was a gift to them, an invitation to go deep before they went wide. The book of Proverbs says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. To search out a matter is the glory of kings." Read that again slowly. It is the glory of God, His reputation, His nature, His greatness, to conceal, not to withhold maliciously, but to conceal wisely, to place treasure in the field and wait for the one who is willing to sell everything they have to buy it. The silences of the Bible are an act of profound respect. They are God treating us not as children who need everything spelled out, but as beloved beings made in His image, made with the capacity to wonder, to seek, to question, to wrestle, and to discover. The mystery is not a condescension. The mystery is an invitation to partnership. There is a moment in the book of Job, after everything Job has suffered, after all his friends have offered their tidy explanations for his pain, after Job himself has cried out for answers, when God speaks from the whirlwind, and God does not explain. God asks questions. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Who shut up the sea with doors? Have you entered into the springs of the sea? Have you perceived the breadth of the earth? Tell me, if you know all this. Question after question after question, and Job does not receive an explanation. He receives something better. He receives the overwhelming, unanswerable, terrible, and beautiful reality of God Himself. And the text tells us that after this encounter, Job is satisfied, not because he got his answers, but because he met the one to whom all questions ultimately belong. That is what the Bible's silences are doing. They are not saying, here is a problem we could not solve. They are saying, here is a doorway. Here is a place where the ordinary logic of human explanation runs out, and something larger begins. Here is where you stop reading about God and start reaching toward God. Here is where the book stops being a document and becomes an encounter. Melchizedek without a past is asking you, do you believe in something eternal? Something that exists beyond the categories of human lineage and human time? The Nephilim without an explanation are asking you, do you believe in a world larger and stranger and more contested than the one you can see? The Transfiguration silence is asking you, can you carry something wholly long enough for it to change you before you speak? These are not intellectual puzzles. They are spiritual invitations. And perhaps the most honest thing I can say, after all of this, is that the greatest mystery of the Bible is not found in any specific story. It is found in the fact that generation after generation, across 3,000 years of human history, in cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, this book continues to ask questions that no one has finished answering, that it continues to draw people into the silence and hold them there until something shifts inside them, that it continues to feel to countless millions of human beings like a living thing, not an artifact of the past, but a present voice, a voice that sometimes speaks in words, and sometimes speaks in the spaces between them. If you have never sat with one of the Bible's silences, truly sat with it, refuse to look up the Wikipedia article, refuse to accept the first answer that presented itself, I want to invite you to try. Pick up the 14th chapter of Genesis and read 3 verses about a king with no history. Go to Genesis chapter 6 and sit with 6 sentences about beings no one can fully explain. Open Matthew chapter 17 and stand on that mountain with 3 terrified men who were told to keep the most extraordinary secret of their lives. And instead of immediately reaching for resolution, try something different. Try remaining in the question, because the question is where God has been waiting for you all along.